You're listening to The Gulf Stream, the official podcast of the Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi.
I'm Ellis Chapman with the Oyster Resource and Recovery Center, and this is the Gulf Stream podcast. With me today, I have AJ Menz, the owner and manager of Blackjack Point Oyster Company. How you doing, AJ?
Doing great, Chappie.
And I also have Amy Belaire with Big Tree Oyster Co. How are you, Amy?
Doing well. Thank you for having us. This is
awesome. So before we really get started, Amy, can you do a quick synopsis? What is oyster farming? Can you explain the process and how oysters are farmed?
Cultivated oysters in Texas, they are grown floating in either bags or cages at the surface of the water, at the top of the water column. So that's different from oysters that are dredged from reefs on the bottom. And cultivated oysters, an oyster farm does not actually require any food or water or fertilizer or chemicals of any type. The oysters are sitting in the floating gear in the bay, filtering and growing. That's it. We're doing various things to manage them and keep them healthy.
Yeah, they're eating and growing just like a natural
the same
oyster.
Food that a reef oyster would eat.
Correct.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no inputs like, negative environmental inputs or outputs. The oysters are sitting there in the gear floating and eating. That is considered a restorative type of food production because it's a net positive for the environment. There's no negative impact to this. It is positive benefits coming as a result of these oysters sitting in their cages and growing.
Where it's better after you're done with it.
Right. And the world is really, we are looking for more sustainable forms of food production, and this absolutely is one. So just to describe what it's like, and the end result is that the oysters are often growing in as single oysters as opposed to clumps. The deeper cups, cleaner because they are growing at the top of the water column, and anything else. Some kind of you can be hand selected at a specific size.
Maybe let me ask y'all, what is oyster farming to y'all, and why did you get into it?
All encompassing is what comes to mind. It's what I eat, sleep, breathe, and do every day.
Whether you want to or not.
Correct. Yes. Why I got into it, it's either because I'm really, really smart or really, really dumb. And I'm not sure which it is just yet. I grew up in Rockport. My father was a commercial fisherman. I worked on boats my entire life, spent 25 years in the marine transportation industry. And when I learned of oyster farming, I really didn't even know what oyster farming was. A friend of mine at a dinner party told me that legislation had been passed by Todd Hunter to allow oyster farming in Texas. So I started looking into it, and it kind of checked a lot of the boxes for me. It gave me an opportunity to work on the same bay system I grew up working on with my father, but doing so in a sustainable, responsible way. And the idea of bringing a product to market, an amazing product to market, was exciting to me. And it seemed challenging. And, Amy and I and a handful of others are essentially the pioneers of oyster farming in Texas. So it's cool to me to start in a new industry in Texas, but the industry's been proven successful in other parts of the country. So we weren't going in completely blind.
Right. Because we are the last state with a coastline to start oyster farming.
Correct.
Amy, what's oyster farming to you?
So my husband, Seth, and I, we were both born and raised in Rockport. Growing up there, Oyster Fest was a big part of our annual celebration. I think we're in the 45th, 46th annual now, but the big celebration in our community that celebrates all things oyster. My parents owned a restoration firm growing up that did a lot of oyster reef restoration, wetland restoration. That was a big part of my life. And I'm a conservation biologist by training. So a lot of my reason for getting into oyster farming did come from my kind of biology and conservation background. I think, as a conservation biologist, we know that oyster reefs are one of the most at-risk habitat types in the world. And when Texas legalized mariculture, we saw this as an opportunity to make sure that oysters could be part of our ecosystem and part of our community and part of our culture moving forward in a way that is really sustainable. And I think, personally, Seth and I also, we sat down and we made a list of 35 reasons why we thought oyster farming would be really cool to get into. And I went back and looked at that list recently and I was like, some of these check out and some don't. But there are a lot of reasons. Seth is also, he builds boats and is a marine hydrographer by training. So has spent a lot of time mapping and surveying all aspects of the Texas coast. So anyway, all of that experience combined, we thought maybe we could give this a shot. Like as a team, we have some interesting skills to bring to oyster farming. So that's what we have been doing for the past year. A little over a year is when we got our first seed in the water.
That's great. 2 Rockport natives. So I guess for the people listening, we should do some little background. The oyster industry started, it was legalized in 2019. The first farm, Texas Oyster Ranch, came in 2021. And now there is 10 farms, I think. 11 fully permitted farms. And there's almost 20 conditionally approved now. You guys are the frontier goldsmen coming into Texas waters trying to strike gold. You think the gold rush will hit? I hope.
We're banking on it.
We need it. Cool. So, well, it's a brand new industry. When you guys got started, I'm sure you guys watched YouTubes left and right. You were asking people like Sea Grant officials and myself, how do I do this? What am I doing? But a lot of this was on the job training. Is that fair to say?
Yes. You can watch YouTube videos and talk to people like yourself and Mario Marquez with Sea Grant and get an idea of how you think it's going to work. And then you go out on the water and see how it's really going to work and figuring it out. And myself with the background on the water that I have and the same with Seth, both of us had enough waterman experience that we had a good idea on building gear and installing gear and those types of things to where it would hold up to the environment that we have here in Texas, which is unlike any other place they're farming oysters. As you can see today, when 15 to 25 mile an hour southeast winds in the spring and summer is common, as our prevailing winds.
Highest average wind speeds in the nation.
Yeah. So, yeah, for sure. I think it's learning as you go. And for me, the installation of the gear and the setup was the easy part. But then you have to learn how to grow oysters and not kill them and make them turn out the way that you want them to turn out and have a good product to take to market.
And I think that there is, Texas being the last state, that does mean a couple of things. It means we have a lot to learn here in Texas, but it means we also have a lot that we can learn from the other states who have gone ahead of us. And so there are some great resources out there, and great research conducted in other places that we are able to look at. And so a lot of that, even, as we were working through our permitting process, learning all of that and understanding what is it, what are the farming techniques that have been proven elsewhere? What are the things that we should keep in mind as we're looking at potential sites? What does it look like to work this kind of gear safely? All of that, I think, was helpful to draw on in our first year of operation, right? Like we do have some great resources from other places, that have been very helpful too. So yes.
Well, before I worked with the position I'm in now, I was operating a research oyster farm in Palacios. And I quickly learned, like you said, Texas is unlike anywhere else. It's so shallow. The waves just don't stop. It comes down to location. And well, tell me about your farms. Where are you guys? What is the site? Where did you choose and why did you choose where you're at? How big is it as well?
You want me to go first?
Go for it.
So our farm we have 5 acres in North Copano Bay. Why Copano? That was a big question for us in our discussions, but it is our backyard where we were born and raised. There have been really, robust oyster populations, wild oyster populations growing really well there in Copano and Aransas Bay. But we also were pretty serious about looking for a site that would offer some protection from this constant wind. And so we did find a spot in the Newcomb Bend area of North Copano, for our farm that met a lot of the, constraints for site selection. You do have to be, a certain number of feet from seagrass, a certain number of feet from existing oyster reefs, from pipelines, from rookeries, from the shoreline, and anyway, various constraints. And so we kind of spent a lot of time thinking about that and finding a site that did meet some of those criteria, and also, you know, kind of had what has supported healthy oyster populations in the past. And like we were talking about, just logistically, you know, you do have to have a land-based component too. And so figuring out your access to that and how you're going to put all the puzzle pieces together requires a lot of
people forget that
a lot of time
part.
and patience. Yeah.
Where are you going to put the cages when they're not in the water?
And once you harvest the oysters, where do you take them? How quickly can you get them there and all that? Yeah.
Leads into another topic of marketing.
Yeah. Sorry, you explain your site too.
Go ahead.
So we have 4 acres and we're in the northern end of Aransas Bay. And like Amy mentioned, you have to find a location that is accessible, right? Especially in the summertime, you have to be able to get your oysters into the cooler quickly. But I drove Debbie, my wife, crazy trying to figure out a location because I took a different approach than Amy. We actually were looking for an area with enough wave action to maybe help tumble oysters and shape oysters, but not too much wave action to where we could not work safely.
Goldilocks zone.
So it was challenging. In the area we're in, the north end of Aransas Bay has traditionally grown amazing oysters for decades. That whole section of the bay has a lot of natural wild oyster reefs. And we're not anywhere near a direct influx from fresh water. So we have a pretty consistent salinity level. It doesn't fluctuate when we get rains inland like some other areas of the bay. And I think time's going to tell how smart any of us were, because not having an oyster background, right? We picked our sites for various reasons that seemed sensible to us at the time. But until we get out there and work the farm and grow the oysters and see the product coming out of the area, that's really going to be the true test of what's a good area and what's not a good area in Texas.
I'm sure both of y'all are noticing, I've learned in my experience, there's a trade-off to everything. There's, as you said, high energy can get you more tumbling, but it can make it inaccessible to working on the farm that day. Being next to a freshwater inflow, that could be a great thing for getting a nice salinity balance for your oysters, but that could shut you down for a couple of weeks in terms of harvesting. What kind of trade-offs have y'all learned about this industry and about oyster farming in general?
I think everything is a potential opportunity to explore. And I think the biggest trade-offs that come to mind are sort of, you have a limited number of hours in the week where you can actually be at the farm and be doing all of the other aspects of running a business. And for me, it's kind of not the kind of trade-offs that you're talking about, but you do have to make decisions every day. What is it that I have to prioritize today? Because there's 60 things on the list.
That's exactly what I'm asking.
Every decision that you make is, I'm trading this for this, and I'm going to trade this for this today. And, you know, balancing that along with the list of things that also come with your family and other aspects of your life is a new exercise in navigating trade-offs. Do you have a better answer?
No. I'm just amazed you have other aspects of your life besides oyster farming. Everything's a trade-off, right? And you listed some of the major ones as far as site selection on, do you want wave action? Do you not want wave action? Accessibility. But to emphasize what Amy's talking about or mentioned, oysters are growing animals, and keeping up with those animals is a full-time job in itself. And then if you want to be in business next year, you also have to do all the other aspects of business, sell oysters, bookkeeping, marketing, that sort of thing. And trading off time to do all those things, your having to not take care of the oysters. Right? It's a trade-off on, okay, how many days can I allot to maintaining the oyster farm, and how many days do I have to deliver oysters, call on new restaurants or distributors, that sort of thing. So it's a balance probably every entrepreneur and businessman out there is living with daily.
Right, because every minute you're not on the farm, you would be marketing or selling your animals or cleaning bags. Can you take me through your application processes? What were some of your challenges and how did you overcome them?
Initially, you meet with TPWD for your site selection. And as Amy alluded to earlier, they say you can pick anywhere you want to be, but you're constrained by being certain distance from all the aspects, the rookeries, the oyster reefs, the seagrass, oil and gas. So the big area becomes smaller. But you meet with TPWD and they help you find a site selection or a site, pick your site, and then you apply to TPWD and they give you what's called a conditional permit. And that just allows you to submit applications to all the other government agencies that you need either approval or leases or permits from. And for me, that's where the bigger challenge arose, was learning the patience of dealing with how slowly government agencies work. And to be fair, it was a brand new industry in Texas. We were the fourth permitted farm in Texas, but we were the only second permitted farm in our area. So the agencies we were dealing with were just like us. They didn't know anything about oyster farming.
Right.
They didn't know the processes that they needed to go through to approve us to have a farm. So they were learning right alongside us. So it took a lot longer than I had originally hoped.
A fair way of putting it. Yeah. What was your application process like, Amy?
I mean, very similar, right? There's multiple state and federal agencies that you have to work through. I think one aspect is just an interesting part to consider is, when you do your first application to Texas Parks and Wildlife, you do actually have to already know, how are you going to lay the gear out? What gear are you going to use? Are you going to be able to afford that gear? There are a lot of questions that you actually have to answer in that very first step. And I think working through the permitting process, one way, as a conservation biologist, that was helpful for me to keep in mind was these permits are ideally set in place so that we are protecting the habitats that are important to us. We are protecting our environments. And it seems like hoops to jump through, but, at the end of the day, that is in spirit what the permitting process is set up to do, is to protect those habitats and what makes some of these places really great places for oyster farms. I think some of the other states who have been doing this a lot longer do have a much more streamlined process than we do here at the moment. But some room for improvement.
Yeah. And, the first ones are always the guinea pigs, unfortunately for y'all, but it does seem like the process is starting to normalize a little bit for the newcomers.
I think so.
So where do you think the industry is going in the next, say, 5 or 10 years compared to traditional public grounds fishing and aquaculture? Where do you see this industry going? Because it's two different markets, right? Oyster farming is based towards the half shell market, the more high end, the white tablecloth, versus like the traditional market is for more of a shucking house. So where do you think our industry could tap into the shucking house?
I can say what I hope. And I don't know that I have any great projections, right? But I do think that there is a real opportunity for this to become a thriving industry in Texas. And I do hope that we move into, over the next 5-10 years, we move into a place where Texans really understand and value oyster mariculture for the sustainable food that it is producing that is grown by local people with tremendous benefits to the environment. I think there's a lot of opportunity to really highlight and recognize the environmental benefits that oyster mariculture is providing.
Can you list some of those for us real quick?
Yes. I think, at the end of the day, from a conservation perspective, there are quantifiable water quality benefits that oysters, whether they're grown on reefs, whether they're grown on an oyster farm, they are filtering nutrients and 50 gallons of each oyster, 50 gallons of water a day. So like a farm like AJ's or mine, it's like 10 million gallons of water a day being filtered by these oysters. And that is day in, day out what these farms are doing. There is a ton of research too on the habitat value that they provide, just by the additional structure being in the water, some of the research that looks at, studies from across the world puts the habitat value from a recreational fishing standpoint on par with that of restored oyster reefs. Some of the neighbors at our farm, they told us it's the trout fishing capital of the world now. Asked us to add more cages.
Do you see looky-loos fishing by your farm?
We have a considerable amount of fishermen that stop by the farm on a regular basis. Where we're located, we're in the thoroughfare from Goose Island State Park, Seagun,
St.
Charles. So all the fishermen are driving by our farm on their way to Carlos and Mesquite and the northern end of Aransas Bay. And we get a lot of traffic in the afternoon looking for triple tails, which are prevalent around all the farms. And there's been a considerable amount of trout that I've been caught around the farm. And most recently, we've seen a couple approximately 40-inch drum in the area of the farm. So the structure that it creates, I've had a conversation with people before, and their thought process was because the oysters were not laying on the bottom like a natural oyster reef is, that you were not creating the same structure for juvenile fish, bait, those types of things, or an attraction of game fish. But after working a farm for over a year now, they're wrong. There's tiny shrimp, tiny crabs.
The mudfish.
Correct. It's amazing the amount of living organisms and animals that we see on a daily basis.
It's a whole ecosystem in each bag. It's one of the coolest things. And those little tiny 1-inch blue crabs that get stuck in there, and they come out, they're like 4 or 5-inch jimmies.
Yeah.
You're like, how did this get in here?
Yeah. And how many of my oysters did he eat?
How much of my seed is gone now?
But I think that's a cool thing to think about too, right? Part of our process in getting the permits from Texas Parks and Wildlife was to verify what is the bottom condition of this 5-acre plot or 4-acre plot. And ours was entirely mud bottom, right? No habitat structure there. And then a year later, all of this stuff is using this habitat structure, and really thriving. It's really cool to see.
Yeah. I can verify ours was mud bottom.
Yeah.
Debbie and I took 576 give or take core samples out of the bay bottom.
And that is exhausting.
It is.
Well, here's a question. So y'all are less than 5 miles by the crow flies. Do you find yourselves competitors? Do you find yourselves friends? How does that dynamic work? Being in the same industry, you would think you'd be competitors. Is that how it is, or is it different?
On a certain level, I think all of us are competitors to a certain degree. A funny story, Amy was actually my stepdaughter's best friend growing up in high school. And
so y'all have known each other for years.
Yes. We
Debbie threw my 16th birthday party at her house.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And neither one of us knew each other wanted to be an oyster farmer. And Debbie ran into Amy at a seminar that was put on over here by Texas Sea Grant when we were both in our application process. And Amy and Seth, with their background, actually helped us out a lot in our permitting process with the Corps of Engineers. And I think we've worked hand in hand from that point to where we are now. And it's cliche, but you say the rising tide lifts all boats. The stage that the industry is in now even though we are all trying to take a product to market, and the market is right now, I think, wide open for the products that we're creating. If we work together, we can grow the industry better than if we're fighting amongst ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the really encouraging things to see as a new oyster farmer is that we are all so supportive of one another. And there really does feel like a supportive community of farmers. I mean, AJ is on my speed dial. And it's so helpful to talk about a million little questions, but also bigger issues that the industry, is facing and would be helpful to tackle together. And I do think, that like he said, there's a ton of opportunity to just highlight the awesome things about oyster mariculture as an industry and what all of the farms are doing, and that these great products are out and available, and becoming more available for Texans to enjoy. And how cool is that? So yeah, I totally agree.
That's such a different approach to a lot of different businesses. That's like very much keep your cards close to your chest. Whereas like y'all business wise, if y'all need seed, it's easier for y'all to go in on seed orders together than to individually buy that. And especially if you can like prorate the percentages. So it's just such a different industry, and it's so refreshing to see. So is there enough demand that it doesn't even encumber y'all?
The demand, I think, is growing. There's demand for half-shell oysters out there. The challenge for all of us right now is educating the public that we are creating oysters right here in the state of Texas that are as good or better than the oysters that they're currently purchasing from the East Coast. Right?
You're on par.
There's a huge half-shell market out there, and there's oyster connoisseurs that enjoy a high-quality oyster. But it's educating those individuals that they can now get the oyster they desire from farms here locally and in the state.
I think I agree. I think I say this a lot, when people have kind of their ideas of a Gulf oyster and an East Coast oyster, I remind them it's the same species that grows Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the East Coast and into Canada. The same species is grown in all of those places. What makes the difference is the waters where they're grown and the methods that they're grown. And now Texas has the methods to grow oysters the same way that the East Coast has been growing them for decades. We are able to kind of create these single oysters that have deeper cups and plumper meats. They are cleaner because they're growing at the top of the water column. They can be harvested year round, fresh source of local seafood, premium, high quality seafood, grown right here in Texas by people that care about Texas and our bays. So yeah, I just think a lot of that is not super well known yet. And so we do have work to do on, getting that information out there more broadly.
Appreciate that. Well, and this plays right into my next question. Bill Walton has told me 100 times, and I've seen it elsewhere, growing oysters is one thing, selling oysters is another. Mm-hmm. You don't make money growing oysters. Because I've helped people, they go through this arduous application process. They go through a 9-month grow out. And finally, when they're ready to sell oysters, they have 500,000 oysters ready to harvest, and they have nowhere to sell them to. How do you market? How do you sell your oysters? I think that's something people forget about when they get through all of that to this final part, which is actually the part that makes your business
work. The most important part, yeah.
That's the business. Let's remember that.
Well, I mean, one thing that and when I was getting ready to start, our oysters were starting to reach harvest size, and AJ kept telling me, Amy, you're going to have to start selling some oysters. Like, you're going to have to do it one day. But it does feel like a big, all of this is a learning curve, right? Like, growing the oysters is a big learning curve. Uh-huh. And then the selling part is your next big learning curve and all of the stuff that goes along with that. But I once I crossed that hurdle, I like to tell the others who are kind of getting into that stage now. Honestly, a lot of times I think these oysters sell themselves. You know, people love oysters. People love Texas oysters. There's a lot about these that I think, yeah.
Like me and my husband from Rockport, X, Y, and Z come to our farm. People eat that up. A lot of times, like you say, the oysters are selling themselves. You're selling that story too.
Yeah. I do think people care about that. They do care who you are and how much care you put into it. I think, being able to talk about that and being able to, explain the kind of methods that you're using and where they're grown and why that matters and why, yeah, the background behind all of it. It's an easy story to tell. And I think it resonates with people, you know. Absolutely. And I think the oysters, they do kind of speak for themselves. And so in some ways that has made it easier than I would have thought. You know, they're great oysters.
Yeah. To Amy's point earlier, a lot of people think Gulf oyster, which technically, right, our oysters are grown in Gulf waters. They have a idea in mind what that oyster is. But if you can get our oysters in the hands of the right people, and by the right people, I mean restaurant owners, chefs that appreciate quality, those types of individuals, more times than not, they do sell themselves. The quality of oysters that are being farmed in Texas right now are as good or better than what they're importing from the East Coast. And they recognize it. When they eat the oyster, when they look at the oyster, when they shuck the oyster, they realize, okay, yes, this was grown in the Gulf, but this is a whole different type of oyster. And they appreciate that. And then at the end of the day, Texans want to support Texas, right? So if you can show them that they can have the same quality product that's grown in the state of Texas, it's an easy sell for them.
That's right. The proof in the pudding.
Yep.
And one thing I'll just add, this is something cool that I don't think I really understood much until recently, but it's a pretty unique and cool thing. If you are working at a restaurant, if you're preparing food at a restaurant or serving food, to actually know the people who created the food that you're serving or helped to grow the food that you're serving, I think that's a pretty rare and exciting thing. And we've had several restaurants reach out to us and say, hey, can you come meet our staff, talk with the staff, tell them what this is like and who you are? And I think in some cases, it's the first time that somebody, you know, working at a restaurant gets to actually meet face to face the person who has grown their food and provided the food that they're serving, which is I think really cool, like a really cool connection, that I didn't really think about early on, but I enjoy that too.
Well, and Shabby, like you said, telling the story, you know, the story is just as important as the product. And chefs, to Amy's point, they think it's kind of cool to say, yes, I know Amy or I know AJ, and they grow the oysters in Aransas and Copano Bay, and some of them have actually been on the farm and seen the operation, so they can tell that story. And it just gives them more ammunition in selling their product to their customers as well.
I see the genuineness when you were telling your story. I see it in your face. I see the inflection. And I think something along with all business is a transparency behind it. And there's no artificial emotion in your face or in your tone. You're saying, yeah, we're out there. We have our interns, X, Y, and Z. And we found these blue crabs in our bags. And you see that joy. And I think that's part of the story. That's the human aspect of it that people love. While we're talking about it, can you tell me about your oysters? What are you trying to sell?
The best oysters in Texas. Yeah. We call our oysters Blackjack Point Oysters, Blackjack Point Oyster Company. That's the name we created for the oyster. A lot of the consumers have shortened that to blackjacks.
Okay.
And so in a lot of restaurants, that's what they're known as.
That's a good nickname.
Yeah. I'm not complaining, you know,
a good nickname.
Customer's always right. Isn't that what they say? So if that's what they want to call them, as long as they're buying them, I'm happy.
As long as the cash is coming in, right?
That's right. But it's a cocktail size oyster. we say it's briny. We're usually in the 25 to 28 parts per million on salinity.
A little salty, but not too salty.
Briny with a hint of seagrass and a clean mineral finish.
Love that. Amy?
Ours, we call ours Big Tree Oysters. And the way that we describe them is deliciously salty, clean, and bright flavor with a slightly sweet finish. Sometimes we hear buttery finish as well, but I do definitely think that like sweet finish for sure is there. Ours are, I think in general, smaller for the most part than the Blackjack Points.
Amy is a super taster, by the way.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
We were at Oyster South and took a oyster sommelier course with Julie.
Yes.
And
those little strips of paper.
Guild?
You can like taste these different strips that she
The
found.
wheel, right?
Yep.
Well, no, yeah.
Well, it was about the wheel, but she had these little paper strips that were bitter or several different flavors that you would put on your tongue, and if you could taste it, you had a superior
tasting ability.
buds.
Yeah.
And Amy was the star of the class.
I taste
Yeah.
all three. Yeah. Some
Wow.
people you just tasted nothing or something, and I could taste something in all three. So yeah, super taster.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what are some struggles of oyster farming?
Currently, there is one major oyster hatchery in the state of Texas producing seed commercially for farms. So seed can be difficult to get at times.
Right.
And if you can't plant baby oysters, you're not going to have big oysters to sell 9, 10, 12 months down the road. So that's always a concern for all of us. Oyster farming is just like any other type of farming. It's very labor intensive. So labor will always be an issue for all the farms. Finding quality employees is a challenge for any business you talk to right now.
I mean, there are various things that are challenging for me physically that I grapple with.
Literally.
Yeah. I mean, one which it took me an embarrassing number of months to figure this out, but we get in the water to flip our cages. That's one of the kind of routine weekly tasks that we do as part of farm management, is flipping the cages so that the oysters can dry out, and various benefits for the oysters, right? But as a short, female, I had to invent a system where I, hook on, and then I can like grab with a rope between my two hooks, and then I can flip the cage. I cannot do it with my own height.
And then you got Seth just one-handing it, right?
Yeah. And then it takes me, I can flip one cage for every 5 that Seth or some of our other folks are able to do. But that's very satisfying. I am still able to do it, but I just needed some support in doing that. And yeah, I think, with any business, and this is something that I remind myself of a lot when I am struggling, is any business, the business owner isn't going to be able to do every single thing that is required in that business. You have a team that you trust that is experienced, and you build that team for any business, whether it's oyster farming or anything else, that can help, make the broader goals and dreams come to life. And that's part of my role as a business owner too, right? Is not being able to physically do every single thing that needs to happen, but being able to put together a team that can collectively accomplish our dreams and goals. And I would add to that, just like any other type of farming, there's also expensive equipment investments at the outset. And then you don't, it takes a while to harvest and to get revenue flowing, right? And so finding available financing to make those equipment purchases happen can be a real challenge. And so just adding that to the list, just like any other type of farming, equipment is expensive, and it takes a while to see the benefits of that equipment in your planting for quite a while. But we can circle back to the labor question, because it would be helpful to talk about
That's a great transition.
internship program that you all started here
Right. ORRC, we supplied 10 internships this summer, paid, and we put them on every oyster farm available in Texas, including Yellowstone's, along with one hatchery. And that was our way, that's one way to help the industry from HRI, the ORRC, how we could help get the industry started. Take some capital burden off y'all, help give you pay you for labor, and then pay you for that. It's a win-win-win. Can you tell us about your interns and how did they do? What they think of it?
The online training,
right, and and online training courses. Thank you.
That was created, I feel like, laid a good foundation of knowledge for our particular intern to have more of like a 30,000 foot view of oyster farming in general, because he learned about hatcheries, he learned about gear, he learned a lot more about the industry than what he saw just on our farm. So I feel that was beneficial for him. And then the hands-on training that we provided on the farm just added to the base that he gained from the online training. And even though the internship is over, he's still employed with Blackjack Point.
So that's one thing where the internship continued on into a full-time position for him.
Yes, sir.
We have the same experience. Our intern who started with us this summer is continuing on with us into the foreseeable future. And I think that's one thing to think about with the growth of this industry is that we are going to see jobs created around this, and I think more types of jobs. I think that is, the hands-on experience on the farm, and all of the kind of steps in going from baby oysters to harvest size oysters to, processing and delivery. There are a lot of steps there that are really valuable to have labor support. But I think there's also, folks with different backgrounds who love the coast and want to get involved and who have kind of technical experience or, scientific experience or marketing or sales. There's room for all of those kinds of jobs as part of this industry moving forward. And I mean, we're already seeing that. And I think this internship program was really helpful in kind of growing the pool of folks who can support and grow the jobs that we're going to see in this industry moving forward.
But that's literally what the ORRC is. We are a workforce development program. We are trying to help build a competent workforce. And, the benefits of oyster farming are more than just the environmental. They filter, they help the natural reefs regrow, but this is a business. This is bringing jobs and capital into communities and creating entrepreneurship for people who may not have ever realized they could have that opportunity. And we just had a workshop in Rockport. AJ was one of our guest speakers. And the whole day we were just talking about business development and how to start a business. What is an enterprise budget plan? And that is the things we're trying to teach these people. Because like you said, that training program, it's not for, you're not going to finish it and say, I'm ready to work on an oyster farm. I know everything about it. But you're going to know what an oyster grow cage is. You're going to know what spat is or seed is. And that's the real benefit behind that. And reinforcing that with the internship is the goal, to take that classroom knowledge and put it into hands-on knowledge so that we can get these people on farms and potentially make new farms, but at least build a competent labor force for you guys right now. So mission success. A couple more things before we close out. So this industry's growing. We got a lot of permits and conditional permits out there. What would you suggest to people who are thinking, maybe I want to get into this? What is it? How would people want to get into this industry?
One piece of advice that I got early on was to go work on an oyster farm for a month before you start your own farm.
And did you do that?
There weren't any farms that we were able to do that on. But
did you work at these?
No, I visited it. Yeah. I should have worked it for a month, and then maybe I would not have an oyster farm. But
but I do think that's very good advice, to see all of the pieces that go into what it means to run an oyster farm.
Right. This is labor. This is labor intensive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's intensive in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different aspects. And I think to sum it up for me, my wife, who is obviously smarter than I am, when I was getting into oyster farming, she said, you just need to be ready for things to happen that you can't even imagine would happen. And because I'm a little more optimistic, I thought, or pathologically optimistic, I thought, well, how hard could it be, right? I'm going to buy small oysters and I'm going to grow them up to big oysters and I'm going to sell them and
get rich quick, right?
Yeah.
It's that easy.
Yeah. You put down on a bar napkin, I'm going to grow
a million oysters a year.
Number of oysters and I'm going to sell them for this and look at all the money. But there's a lot of things that can happen, and things, just like Debbie said, that happen that you could not even have imagined would happen. So,
yeah. And I think it's also a good exercise in, any kind of farming does mean there is a whole lot that's outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
The weather, how well, a particular batch of oysters is growing.
People.
Yeah. There's, there's a lot that's unpredictable. I do think, that laying a lot of the groundwork in advance, for kind of accounting for the uncertainty, I guess, was helpful for me. Like, here's some very bad case scenarios. Here's some good case scenarios. And somewhere all of these may happen over the next 10 years. Are we okay with that? And, what will that mean? How do we prepare and plan for that? I think, there's a lot, there's just a lot that's out of your control, but kind of understanding and accounting for that has been very helpful to me and necessary.
Expect the unexpected.
Yeah. To touch on something you mentioned earlier, Chappie, talking about the seminar in Rockport and then growing jobs in the area. This industry, especially right now in the Rockport area, we have 7 farms in Aransas and Copano Bay that have oysters in the water. Rockport is quickly
It's the hub.
Becoming a hub for oyster farming in the state. And that, to me, is exciting.
Yeah.
Because even more than creating a handful of jobs for the local economy, we're on the cusp of being a destination for people to come to sample Texas farmed oysters. Mm-hmm. You come down and you can have oysters from 7 or 8 different farms in one little spot. And that goes beyond creating a job on an oyster farm. It creates another job in restaurants because mm-hmm. they have to have people to shuck the oysters. It creates business for the art industry, the art galleries downtown, the hotels, because when they come down to eat our oysters, they're not just going to eat oysters and drive back to San Antonio or Austin or Houston. So it's beneficial to the entire community way beyond the scope of the jobs that we create specifically on the farm.
You know, exactly that. And I want to expand on that. And I think there's exponential power when you look at the power of the internet. Mm-hmm. People are going to go to latitudes mm-hmm. and they're going to say, I tried Blackjack Point Oyster Company. Or they're going to go to the Boiling Pot and they're going to say, I had Big Tree Oysters today. And they're going to post that on Instagram. Well, then that's going to get 50 likes and they might share it. And now it's gone to 1,000 people instantly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly going to reinforce what you're talking about. Well, now I want to go to Rockport. I want to see the art walk. I want to see X, Y, and Z. Shoot, let's go to the Boiling Pot and try their stuff while we can get Big Trees. And mm-hmm. I think, like you said, it's not even just building an industry. It's building a whole experience. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Rockport, that was on purpose, but I think it lucked out in a very positive way. Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that. I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. I think one thing that we've talked about too is, even though, multiple different farms growing and within a couple of miles of each other in, Aransas Bay and Coconut Bay, when you get all of those oysters together on a plate, they all look different. They all taste a little bit different. Right. It really is like a flight of beers, where you're sampling 5 or 6 different varieties. You're able to do that now with oysters, and what a cool thing.
And that's so crazy. Yep. They're so close to each other, but how is you guys are 5 miles apart. Mm-hmm. These are 2 different, I would think these are different states.
Yep.
And that just goes into the cultural methods and location.
Mm-hmm. Well, and an oyster is a product of the water it's grown in. And even though we are only 5 miles apart, there's differences in the water. And right. When you have Amy's oysters beside my oysters, you can taste a difference. There is a tasteable difference. Even for a non-super taster, you can taste the difference in the oysters.
Right.
And that's cool for people that enjoy that type of experience.
And as farmers, there are 1,000 different decisions that we've made every day along the way, getting those oysters to harvest. And I think that's reflected in what you see too, right?
Absolutely.
Where yes, the waters are, have some similarities and overall our methods are similar. But there are a million different decisions that we make differently. And that does reflect in these different oysters, worth tasting and trying. Yeah.
Well, for anybody who's still listening and they want to try your oysters, I recommend going to txoystertraining.org, and we have a map showing where farmed oysters are known to be sold at. And we've got a couple places that have both of y'all's oysters. So we fully encourage people, if they want to support this industry, eat farmed oysters.
Yeah. So I would like to go one step beyond what you'd mentioned. You guys, on your website, you have the list of restaurants all across the state that serve Texas farmed oysters currently. But if the listeners want to support the industry, when they go to restaurants that are not on that list, they need to request Texas farmed oysters.
Absolutely.
Because to grow this industry, we need more restaurants and more patrons buying and eating Texas farmed oysters.
Right. And I think Amy said it earlier, there's a public education to this. Aside from the general public should know, but the restaurants also teaching these chefs or these restaurant owners, what is this? Why are we different? Why should I pay this instead of this? And explaining the whole process. Well, it's better. It's more sustainable. They're supporting more local jobs, X, Y, and Z. And I think training, giving public knowledge out there is really going to be the main important aspect in that. Just the general education of what is oyster farming.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That back up.
Yeah. And even further, the chefs and restaurant owners need to know we're here in the product we're creating, but the restaurant patrons can drive that demand.
Absolutely.
Right?
Customers always
because
right.
They have to be willing to buy Texas oysters versus a different type of oyster. So they're the ones that can really help support this industry and grow it to where we hope it will be in 5 or 10 years, like you mentioned earlier.
I agree. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking oysters for an hour.
Only an hour? Yeah.
Well, on the recording. Thank you guys, and go Texas Oysters.
There you go.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, consider contributing to a greater Gulf by visiting harteresearch.org. That's HARTE research.org.